Knock at the Sky with Liz Charlotte Grant. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I'll be in conversation with Liz Charlotte Grant. Liz's book, Knock at the Sky, is available from January 2025. I recommend it for anyone who considers themselves a doubter, questioner, or deconstructor. It is a book that will bring new perspective to female characters in Genesis. I appreciated Liz's book and found her witty and engaging to converse with. I am sure you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. As always, the links to topics we raise are in the show notes, including links to Liz's website and where to buy her book. During this conversation, I make reference to an alternative telling of the Abraham and Isaac story. I was unable to find the version I referenced, maybe I dreamt it, but I did find another retelling which is also interesting to listen to. See link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to details on elements of Abraham's story that you may not find in the Bible. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is your usual host Matthew. Unfortunately Andrew is unable to join me this evening. We will get in touch. Andrew will appear again, I do promise you that. I am here doing another author interview. I love the way that I keep getting thrown authors to come and have a chat with. It's as though somebody thinks I do something that's okay. And I'm quite happy with being okay if it means that I get authors to talk to. Liz Charlotte Grant, thank you for coming on to Still Unbelievable. I have read your book. I have listened to you on a couple of other podcasts. Welcome to Still Unbelievable.
Thank you so much for having me. And, that's more than most authors get. Most of the time we go on podcasts and they don't know what we are or what we've written or I'm delighted.
Really, if I have to listen to something, I have to listen to the author if I've got one on. So I don't like being the first podcast because I want to hear them. I want to hear what they've said. So bad luck to whoever's first. I like to be able to hear how they talk. And I obviously like to be able to read what they've written, because if they're here to talk about something that they've written, I need to have done them a favor. That's the wrong phrase, but I need to have done my own homework and read their work. And if it means I get a free copy of something to read, well, nobody's losing here.
I agree with you. I'm the same way. Yeah.
Okay. So before we get on to you, Liz, I'm going to throw you to the wolves for a second here. You're not prepared for this. I haven't warned you about this question. But we did talk in the run-up that I work for a drinks producer here in my part of the UK. And one of the benefits of working for this drinks producer is I get some product to take home. So this evening, I got 3 bottles of the wonderful apple-based product that my company works for. And let's just say there is a fermentation process involved. So that should give you enough of a spoiler. So we're launching 3 brand new products this month. And so I've got 1 bottle of each product to take home to enjoy this weekend. But I have somebody who I share my home with. What should a responsible husband do in that situation? Should he hide them away and enjoy them himself, or is he obliged to share them?
Oh, I think you have to share.
But I've earned them. They're mine. I've
share.
earned them.
I would want to share them with you personally, but if you hide them away so that they don't know, you might get away with it.
Yeah, I wouldn't get away with that. I absolutely would not get away with that. Obviously, that's tongue-in-cheek, and obviously that was a bit of fun. Liz, you say on your website, and I love this, but there's clearly an edginess about you that's attractive. So you say on your website, I'm a storyteller, a progressive Christian who believes in extending empathy to all, no exceptions. Now, clearly there's a couple of dog whistles in there to a certain demographic. Why would you write something so toxic on the top of your website?
Because I'm trying to poke at them. The folks listening to this podcast understand the Christian culture of the United States, I'm sure, to some extent. That's where I grew up within white American evangelicalism. I was telling Matthew, I've lived in Europe, but I am culturally American. I really am. And so, within that culture, empathy is not something that is popular right now. I don't know if you know about the book that came out called Toxic Empathy.
Wow, that's an interesting pairing of words to put on a book cover.
It is a strange choice. What has been interesting the past few years is that some conservative Christians in the United States have started to associate empathy with this kind of toxic kind of all-inclusiveness that they have decided is politically correct, or I don't know what they would say about it, to be honest, because it feels so left field to me. Like it feels like if Jesus is about if Jesus is real and if Jesus is about anything, I believe it would be empathy.
Yes.
That just seems like the point of religion overall, to extend some empathy to someone else, to try to put yourself in their shoes, to try to understand, to try to care for them as you would like to be cared for, right? That's the golden rule.
Yes, absolutely. Do unto others. And empathy seems to be the only way that could possibly be achieved.
Correct. Yes. So
yes.
I'm mystified, but I definitely, it's funny because I write a newsletter called The Empathy List, and I started this newsletter before a lot of the talk that was going around that started in these conservative circles about empathy being a quote unquote sin.
Wow.
And I felt like I'd been put in the right place at the right time in some sense to just say, that's not true. That's utter nonsense. And I am not playing that game.
Right. And good for you. And dear listeners, you know I put show notes in. If you haven't checked my show notes by now, start here. There will be links to Liz's website, and you'll be able to find the newsletter, The Empathy List, which will include a way to subscribe to it. So check the show notes. Now, I'm going to briefly reference another author who we mentioned. So very recently, I interviewed Becca McNeil, beautiful author, and I mean beautiful objectively in the way that she writes. And I made reference in that interview, if you haven't listened to it, listeners, and you should have, to how she challenged me about empathy in her writing. But my challenge to you, Liz, is in response to that episode, I had an email, a very nice email from a regular listener saying that was one of my best interviews ever. So that is the bar that I'm aiming for with this conversation with you. So let's get on to the reason why you're here, Liz, and that is your book. Now, I'm going to give you an opportunity to laugh at me, because from my background and my exit from Christianity, I read the title of your book and I went, yes, this is a book that's going to put into words my deconstruction, because I deconstructed because of the failure of Genesis to match science. And here is a great author who has written a book critiquing all the science in Genesis and why it's all wrong, and this is going to validate my journey. And the knock at the sky bit was very much
disappointing.
I'm getting there. You've ruined my punchline. Yeah, and your title, Knock at the Sky, resonated with part of that journey for me, because part of that journey for me was knocking on an invisible glass ceiling saying, God, where are you? Knock, 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 where are you? And a big section of my journey felt like that. So I saw the title and I saw the promise and I read it and I got heaps and heaps of empathy and not at all what I was expecting. So congratulations on ruining my day. But your book is a great read.
I'm a disappointment to many.
Your book is a great read.
Thank you.
I do recommend it to our listeners. Do read it. So why did you choose to disappoint me in the writing of your book?
Well, at the time I didn't know you personally, but now it is personal, Matthew. No, I think I became interested in returning to Genesis for myself because, like you, so many people I know have found Genesis to be so deeply problematic, like the way that it is used culturally as a cultural weapon against people, whether that is LGBTQ folks, whether that is women, whether that is, I believe, even men. I think the ways that this ancient text has been used and abused is reprehensible. And I think for myself, I'm not a theologian. Just so your listeners know, my expertise is creative writing. That is what I studied. That is my interest. And so I read the book of Genesis from this literary perspective, which is to say, I don't actually address issues of historicity almost at all. I almost completely avoid those questions. I think there are a couple times probably where I dance around the issue, but really that is not the point for me in writing this book. And so the point was much more to explore this ancient masterwork from a literary perspective. So for me, I wanted to, in the way that you do with any book, any story, I wanted to sort of surrender to the world created by the authors. And so, whenever you read a book, you're sort of surrendering to the story, to the characters, to the themes. You kind of enter this like flow, you jump in the river and you just kind of go with it, right?
Yes.
And so that is how I wanted to approach this book. I think, making science out of this book is nonsense, obviously. I also think, approaching it in a way that we need to validate ourselves is nonsense, right? So, and that's often kind of why we're approaching a book like this from a scientific viewpoint. But I would say, good art like this that has lasted for centuries, millennia, art like this continues to speak and continues to form, especially Western culture. And so I wanted to understand, what does this still have to say to us? Even if, my beliefs have changed, like I said, I call myself a progressive Christian, which is sort of a hodgepodge term anyway. No one quite knows what that means. In my case, it means I'm not evangelical anymore, and I'm in the mainline American church, currently attending a Presbyterian Church of America, PCUSA, actually. No, not PCA, PCUSA. So, for those who know denominations, there's a big difference between the two. And I think for me, it was just much more important to approach the text as art and see where it took me.
And I think that comes across in the way you've written it, because those of us who are in my position, who have looked at Genesis from a more critical standpoint, are aware that there is this hypothesis that certainly the first couple of chapters of Genesis are poetry, and in the translation over millennia, that source and that pattern of poetry or song or whatever it was is completely lost. It's just not replicatable in any of the languages that the world speaks today. So we've lost all of that. But it's normally assumed that is applied to the creation account and maybe a little bit after. But you spend a significant chunk of your book around the story of Abraham, or Abraham to probably be more technically accurate. What was your decision around that?
Yeah, so this book is, it's an interdisciplinary commentary. So I'm looking at the book of Genesis and reading it as a literary writer, interpreting it as such. I'm also interpreting it using all sorts of different commentators that are, mostly I wanted to not hear from dead white guys.
Yes.
So I myself am white. I have read and know a lot of wonderful theologians who are dead white guys, and also some of them have been harmful and abusive and all sorts of problems. For myself, I needed to read it from a different lens. I needed to hear different perspectives. And so that is actually part of the reason that I returned to Abraham, or Abram in the text, because I find him such a problematic character. It's an incredibly dysfunctional family that is shown in this text. And I cover the beginning of Genesis through Genesis 32, which is Jacob wrestling with an angel or God or whatever. There's like this myth of Jacob rolling around in the dirt at night with someone and then
That
walking
is a
away with a
weird
limp.
story in itself, isn't it?
Oh, I love that story. It's so strange. Yes. I think I'm drawn to these strange stories, and Genesis is just chock full of them. There's so many strange stories and characters in this book. I wanted to address sort of first encounters with God according to the Genesis author. And of course, Abraham is this classic, Abraham hears from God. Get thee out is the translation I love the best. God's command to Abram, and he walks away from family and land and inheritance and his former religion to follow an invisible deity into the desert without knowing where he is going. And so that's a compelling story on its own. But then you add in these layers of different characters in this dysfunctional family history. And I come from a dysfunctional family originally. And so I think like many of us, right, we have lots to heal from usually when we reach adulthood. And so for myself, I was curious to return and say, with a lens now and kind of an understanding of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, just through my own experiences, unfortunately, I am curious how this reads now to me. How do I interpret and understand this story with this founder of three faiths? Abraham is the founder of three faiths. And I just was very curious to reapproach. Yeah, I I don't view him very kindly after that reapproach. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the patriarch Matthew.
Well, yes, post religion, my views on Abraham have changed quite significantly. I mean, I grew up being fed Abraham as being a great man of faith, and the deconstruction, or rather more accurately, the deconverted community, there's this phrase, the Abraham test, that goes around a lot. And the Abraham test is viewed very dimly by unanimously throughout the deconstructed community. And we only need to look at modern history to see stories of people who believe that they've been told that their deity has told them to kill their children. And we rightly view that with horror.
Yes.
And yet we do not, yet somehow judgment is suspended for Abraham. And I know personally people who would be far more strong in their response about that than I'm being now, but I am disgusted by that story.
Yeah.
And it's,
and
so
in
that's
particular, you mean the story of taking Isaac to the mountain to slaughter him.
I'm talking like I admit, like my listeners know, and I'm assuming, but we should say it for what it is. Yeah, it's taking his child up a mountain to slaughter his child, and I'm being very gracious by not saying those words. Yes.
Yeah.
We should speak the horror, because that is what it is. And as a quick aside, I'm assuming you know of Seth Andrews.
No, tell me more.
Seth Andrews is an ex-evangelical Christian. He has his own podcast. But the reason why I mention him is on his podcast, and now I'm going back a couple of years, he read a fictional short story of that event from Abraham's life of taking Isaac. But the story is written from Sarah's perspective, and Sarah realizes what's happening, and she manufactures the voice at the top of the mountain and the goat, or rather ram, stuck in the bushes, all without Abraham realizing it. And it's quite a twist, and I really enjoy that story.
Fascinating.
I don't know what the story's called. I don't know who wrote the original story that Seth read out. Seth has a lovely reading voice, and so he reads the story very well. Listeners, if I can find it, because I'll be reminded when I go through the edit, I will put a link in the show notes. So check there. If it's not in the show notes, good luck finding it. But it does a really good job of just taking all the supernatural elements out of the story. And when you do that, the horror of the story really comes up. And I love it that it's the woman who is not named enough in the story who is the hero of that short story.
Mm-hmm.
And the man is just a prick, frankly.
I mean, one of the things that was fascinating to me in studying these characters, and I used, as I said, I used a lot of commentators who are not the dead white guys, right? So I used a lot of Black liberation and womanist theologians to interpret, especially.
You do, and that comes out in your writing.
Yes, especially the women in these texts, because of course, women in the Bible are sort of side characters at best, most of the time. They are known because of who they birthed or who raped them or, I mean, there's some really appalling stories that I as a woman, I feel incredibly offended by. I think for myself, it was very interesting to read these alternative perspectives because I think coming at the text as a white, cishet, gender normative woman, I needed a different perspective. So I went back to Dolores Williams, who is one of the founding Black womanist liberation theologians, and she in particular sees Hagar as sort of a model for Black women, the Black female story in the United States, which of course has been horrific also. Her retelling kind of gave me an imagination for understanding, she sees the story as a story in which God calls and resources and it eventually liberates an enslaved woman and gives her a well in the desert, which of course was wealth and prosperity and a way to survive, and also then gives her generations later after her in which she becomes the matriarch of a new family line. Now, I still struggle with that reading because the enslaved woman Hagar is forced to become a surrogate of Abraham's child, is abused by Sarah so dramatically that she actually runs away into the desert pregnant with no water, supplies, anything. The rabbis say that she was running for Egypt. I mean, imagine walking from Israel's region, the region of Iraq, and going south to Egypt on foot while pregnant. So there's still, and then when she arrives at a well, which was a risk, God tells her to return to her slave masters. So I continue to struggle with this text, which feels so deeply unjust. And yet I found myself wanting to make space for these other perspectives and say, maybe I get it wrong from my perspective. Maybe I read this story with some privilege. And so what does it look like to say, this woman, Dolores Williams, who is a scholar of both Black female faith and of Genesis, she reads the story and says the only way that Hagar would have survived another day is to return. Like, she will die in the desert, and God tells her to return and saves her life. And then later, when she is yet again kicked out of the house, this time by Abraham and Sarah, both, we expect her to die, and she doesn't die. She discovers a well. So there are layers to the story that I continue to kind of have questions about. Now, with the Abraham test in particular, I think that one is very challenging. And I did not start to understand and even kind of come to terms with it until I started digging into the Midrashic literature. So some of the kind of early Jewish writings that make a lot of space for the silences in the work, which I find fascinating. And in that chapter, I just sort of tell and retell their stories of what this event means to them. There's a lot of, in Christian theology and in rabbinic theology, there is a lot of sort of backbending to try to make sense of a lot of these seemingly contradictory things. People assume God is good, and so therefore this cannot be true, that God would say to slaughter the chosen son on top of a mountain. And yet, what does it mean if God does do that? I mean, I think it's actually a much more interesting story for all of us to kind of stop and think through. And this is, of course, this has led to some people to atheism, because what the fuck?
Yes, exactly. I think that's an appropriate response to that. And there's a weird dichotomy in there, in that Abraham's nearly slaughter of Isaac is seen as an act of faith, and God rescuing Isaac from that situation, although it was his plan all along, is somehow seen as glorious, that God put them through this trial just to prove a promise. I mean, was there really no other way to do it? Did he really have to choose such a dramatic way to prove a little point? While at the same time, Ishmael and his mother Hagar are sent off out into the wilderness, and whether they live or die is utterly inconsequential. It's by happenstance that they live and Ishmael creates a great nation, but it's of no relevance whatsoever. He could have just perished and died on a dry lake bed with his mother and never been seen by anybody. The story would have been no different, and the readers would have cared no less.
Yep. And I think that is deeply disturbing. I agree. I think one of the things that clarified, or maybe I wouldn't even say clear, I think one of the things that made sense to me as I studied this text, that I felt many writers had not touched on enough, was the tie between the way that Hagar is treated, Hagar and Ishmael, and the way that then Isaac is treated by God. And I started to see some kind of synonyms, like these were kind of, there was a parallel here that I needed to observe. I needed to observe that as the woman is abused and her son is rejected, Abraham's son seems to be rejected, right? And there is this kind of parallelism. I mean, that is more karmic than it is Christian to think that this is the punishment for Abraham's and Sarah's mistreatment of Ishmael and Hagar. So again, I kind of wonder at our interpretation of it. I still don't know what to make of this story. Just being frank, I find it to be utterly disturbing, and I can never imagine doing such a thing. The way that the rabbis make sense of it is that they say that the test was to take the son there and to bind the son. So they call it the binding of Isaac.
But the story goes into a bit more detail than just binding, though, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I think where I come to it is to say, what if Abraham got it wrong? But I don't know that for sure. I mean, I think there is a lot about these early scriptures that are deeply troubling. And I think it's interesting to me that they are troubling. I can't defend these actions, nor can I defend God here,
Yeah. And surely, though, it's got to be a sign of good moral character to read this story and say, I'm troubled by this. Because to read the story and then spend however long it takes to write a detailed theological analysis of why this is a good thing that God did, or why it's all an act of faith, surely to do that is a troubling, heartless thing to do if you never at any point acknowledge the horror that is that story. Because the other thing that we haven't mentioned, but we are both acutely aware of, is Sarah saying to Abraham, I can't bear children, take my maidservant instead.
Mm-hmm.
That whole thing reeks of non-consent.
Mm-hmm.
And that is problematic as well. And that is not a modern thing. Sarah must have known what that must have been like as a woman to command her husband to do that. It's not, because consent isn't a new thing. Consent isn't something that we've only become aware of in the past 20 years.
No, I mean, this was an enslaved woman, so she was their property. So again, we're dealing with several of these layers of unjust societal norms, and really reprehensible behavior. I think the thing for me, which was deeply troubling, was seeing how quickly theological commentators tried to turn it around to say that it was still a faithful act.
Yeah.
When even the text itself is saying that it is an unfaithful act.
Yes.
That they actually did not have faith in God. And this is why Abraham had sex with Hagar to have a baby. They didn't believe that God would give them a son. And therefore, Sarah intervenes. Now, is it reasonable, and I say this in the book, is it reasonable that after 10 to 15 years of not having a child, that Sarah and Abraham would assume that there was no child coming? Of course that's reasonable.
Yeah.
Of course it is. And I think that's another part of the story. So often, and I saw this in the commentaries of, early Christian fathers, church fathers, like Augustine, Chrysostom, they would say that really it was Sarah's unfaithfulness. It wasn't Abraham's unfaithfulness.
It's always the
Sarah
woman's
had
fault,
failed.
isn't it?
Always the woman's fault, right? She made me do it. And I think the other part of it that was very disturbing was hearing from them that Abraham didn't even sin as he had the woman in his sheets. They're doing something, and they're saying, as he is laying with Hagar, he is not lusting after her. He has his mind only set on children. And I'm like, I don't think that has ever happened. I mean, that is a miracle too far for me.
That is such a privileged white guy thing to say. I mean, let's be honest about it.
I know. I was astonished by that interpretation. I'm like, anyway, that one was absurd to me because it felt like a crisis management meeting in a mega church where they're going, how do we frame it so that the founder is still a good guy?
Yeah.
Even though he's done whatever, this just, indiscretion.
And then the true victims,
he's abusive.
And then the true victims of this story, which are Hagar and Ishmael, they get the majority of the blame for it all going wrong.
Right. Yep. They're abused. They're thrown out into the desert. They have no advocate. I think the one thing that was a comfort to me is that when Hagar runs into the desert the first time, God is actually the first, according to the narrators, to speak her name. So before that point in the text, none of the other characters even use her name. Sarah and Abraham do not address her by her first name.
You're testing my knowledge of that passage. I'm desperately trying to remember it. It's been so long since I've read it.
Yes.
But interesting thing here.
They say, take the slave girl or take this woman. You do what you want with her. I mean, there's no personal naming of Hagar by Abraham and Sarah within the text, which I found very interesting.
Yes, you do actually say that in your book. Yes, I remember.
Yes, and then she comes out into the desert, and whoever she meets, whether she's hallucinating, whether she's meeting an angel or God or another person, we don't know, but they use her name, Hagar.
That's quite fascinating. I'm sure there's probably some theological point that can be made about God naming Hagar in that point. Maybe there's some kind of redemption flower that can be brought out of that, but Genesis never goes there. But Interesting side point, and feel free to judge me on this. When my wife and I were talking about this interview, and we talked a little bit about your book, and I'd forgotten that you'd mentioned Hagar by name in your book. And one of us said, what was her name anyway? And we'd both completely forgotten her name, and we had to dig out one of our devices and do a search to find out what her name was. That is how little known she is amongst people who should know better.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that is so revealing. And I would say not of you. I would say culturally within kind of these Christian spaces, and then even beyond, when we think about the Bible as a whole and how people interact with biblical themes within Western culture, the fact that her name is not known, I think, is very significant. It speaks a lot about our cultural patriarchy and preference for the male founder. You know, I talk about the male founder CEO in the garage.
Yes.
You know, founding the tech company in his garage. I think we really want our founders to be like that. We want them to be faultless. We want them to have overcome something, have kind of come from nowhere and be geniuses and completely trustworthy. This is what we want from our heroes. I mean, I think so much about American evangelical culture anyway is celebrity focused. And so many of our abuse scandals within Christianity have focused around these celebrity figures who are allowed to do whatever they want, basically, because people assume they should be moral, we should trust them, and they show themselves not to be trustworthy. And I mean, I just see some of the same pattern with even how we relate with Abraham. Instead of saying, you know, the Bible tells a very complex psychological story about people who lived 2,500 years ago, you know, or however long it was. We don't really know. We don't know if they lived for real.
Yes, quite. And there's so little we can know about their stories.
So little. Yes.
Yeah. So in your researching for the book, because you obviously did do a lot of research about Abraham specifically, what extra biblical legends are there about this narrative, and how critically do they differ, and how much of a different light do they shed on this story?
There's much more of a biography backstory to Abraham within the Midrashim. The rabbis sort of think of him as an Elijah figure or like an Isaiah figure, where his father, so there's a whole kind of tie into Babylon and the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, King Nimrod, who is kind of tied into the Tower of Babel. You know, he seems to be this mighty man who treks across the desert and seems to have a whole train of people behind him. And then it seems like he could be the one who makes people build this tower in the desert. So anyway, the rabbis kind of tie him into the Abraham story, the Abraham narrative, and they say, well, King Nimrod worshipped other deities, and like most Babylonians would have. And in fact, Abraham's father was a maker of idols. And that was his trade. And Abraham worked in the shop. And so he was recruited, to be, to sell idols to his neighbors in the market. And there are these scenes about Abraham destroying idols, destroying the king's idols who he'd been tasked to babysit, and then he puts, the axe in the biggest idol's arms and says, "Well, they did it." I mean, he's like making fun of his father's customers. He's just being a troll to these other worshipers. And then there's a whole kind of series of sort of Midrash, the sort of Daniel story where they're thrown to the lion, or, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fire. There's a whole kind of series of stories like that between Nimrod and Abraham, these kind of showdowns where he's burned and then rescued and, like a true martyr. And this is all, theoretically, before God calls him away from his homeland. So this is the prequel of Abraham's story, according to the rabbis. Now, again, these read as myths to me. But not unlike a lot of Genesis.
Frankly, yeah.
I would also say that one of the most interesting parts of the story to me actually was the recounting of Abraham's birth, in which his mother, I think there's a prophecy about Abraham that this man will take down Nimrod or something. And so, like King Herod, Nimrod is going after the baby Abraham. And so Abraham's mother goes out into a cave in the desert to give birth. And then she leaves her son there, assuming that he's going to be eaten by, I don't know, coyotes or something. And instead, the story goes that the archangel Michael essentially breastfed Abraham.
Wow.
to keep him alive. And the way that it goes is that, and I couldn't really ever quite picture this, but it was like if Abraham sucked on his pinky, milk would come out.
Right.
And, the archangel Michael is his babysitter, I guess, in the cave. And then after 10 days, he is walking and talking. And so Abraham is drinking milk from his finger, and then he's walking and talking by 10. Then he leaves the cave and has this whole spiritual kind of peyote encounter with God in the desert. And then he is reunited with his family eventually. And, but it's a kind of wild, it's such a wild story.
It sounds like they cut the most interesting bits when they assembled the Bible.
I know. I'm like, and I was fascinated because I had never heard these stories.
No.
White American evangelicalism, and I think evangelicalism as a whole, is so cut off from historical sources.
Yeah.
Even, I didn't learn anything about the church fathers. I didn't understand the desert fathers and mothers. Finding some of these legends of really wild, crazy shit, batshit crazy faith, I wanted to find some of those stories because I think these legends and this text of the Bible doesn't make a lot of sense without some more color.
Yeah.
And I just wanted more color,
Yes. I'm kind of torn because, I'm assuming you did too. I had a very fundamentalist evangelical upbringing. It was the Bible and nothing else. And anything that remotely felt like it told a story that was similar to the Bible, but wasn't the Bible, was rejected. So my enthusiasm for those things had been killed before I was even old enough to choose to read. But now I find that I'm really fascinated by this kind of thing. And it puts new color into the stories that are in the Bible. And you go, well, of course, it all makes more sense now. It's just part of a collection of myths. What arrogance to pull these out fully out of context, remove it from its historical place, and then lift it up onto a pedestal that it doesn't deserve. No wonder people have a bullshit appreciation of how it holds together. And no wonder people have completely misunderstood the entire whole swathes of it. Just look at Ken Hammond and what he's done from complete misunderstanding of what the Bible is trying to say.
You know what? I visited the Ark Encounter recently because I have family in that region of the United States, and I honestly, extended family wanted to visit this. So the Ark Encounter is a full-size ark that Ken Ham has financed and built in Kentucky. As a structure, it's actually very impressive. It's one of the largest timber frame, if not the largest in North America. 100% timber frame. It's this huge boat. It's a wild, wild structure. But I walked in and, there's bamboo kind of enclosing cages, and they made lights out of clay, and clay pots and waterers out of clay pots, and there were so many animatronic dinosaurs in the cages.
Really? Wow.
I was like, they really doubled down on the dinosaurs. I'm not sure quite why, but I think one of the things that was fascinating is I'm walking through this and going, And one family was supposed to have built this in, I don't know, 150 years. I mean, maybe, but I it's like, I believe this so much less than I would have before, because it took Ken Ham millions of dollars and hundreds, if not thousands of people to create this. Somehow we're supposed to believe that this happened in this way, and then of course they're creating their own language around the flood narrative. And one of my favorite parts was they're trying to define, what was it like before the flood that God would have poured out judgment like this onto people. And there are these tiny little display cases, you can look in and you see a little diorama scene. And there's one that's like a Colosseum and people are fighting each other, in the Colosseum. And then to the right of the diorama, you see a dinosaur, a T-Rex, coming into the Colosseum.
Oh my word.
So one of the things that God was really mad about is that T-Rexes and humans were fighting in Colosseums, and that's why the flood needed to happen. So I mean, just, and that's a ridiculous example. So much of that exhibit for me honestly just made me feel really sick. I just, the people who are attending this museum, coming to this museum, they are true believers for the most part. And I just thought about what do these men have to gain by providing these answers? For providing this level of certainty. I think for me, one of the things this book became about was sort of unraveling the doctrine of inerrancy pretty gently, but trying to create space for alternative voices to sit at the table, the interpretative table. And one of the things that has been so deeply disturbing to me over years is watching how certain men within evangelicalism will not let go of power.
Yeah.
And their power comes from this knowledge, comes from having this secret knowledge from God delivered specially to them. Theirs is the only voice to listen to if we want to know what God thinks. And I think it has stolen the autonomy from so many people who could, with their agency, do justice in this world, and are being convinced by others not to. And I think so much about this book project for me was saying, you can reclaim your spiritual autonomy. You can find your agency again. Even if you believe that this book is 100% true and inspired, you can still find a way to read this book that honors people and honors your own sense of agency.
And that's brilliant. That absolutely is. And that touches on probably the one thing I appreciated most about of your book and your writing style, which comes across, which is the gentleness with which you write and the gentleness with which you expressed yourself and alternative narratives in this book. Look, I'm 15 years out of Christianity. I don't need to be treated gently. I appreciated a good bit of spikiness now. And I am not offended by somebody dumping a pile of shit onto my favorite part of the Bible. I can cope with that. But there are many who aren't there. There are many who are only recently in their deconstruction journey. They're still very sensitive. They're possibly emotionally raw in all sorts of areas. And Genesis is a treasured part of that. And for a lot of these people, Genesis needs to be treated gently and special care. And my brand of spikiness is not what those people need to hear. And your book, whatever. But your book is good. Your book is good there, and it took me in a direction that I didn't expect. And you took me on a journey of Sarah through many chapters in your book that even now, at past half a century, I had never appreciated from that perspective. So thank you Liz, for that. Even as somebody who utterly rejects all of that, I found something in that to appreciate. And so for somebody, if I had still been in the early part of my deconstruction journey, your writing in this book would have brought me to tears. It genuinely would have moved me a lot more. And so there are people out there who are still feeling raw, still feeling tender, who is still finding their way in their deconstruction journey, who don't know where to look, who don't know where to turn. Your book will help those people. It will help to put them into a perspective. And so, dear listener, if you are one of those people, or if you can't bear me, but you know somebody who does need this book, it really is the right kind of book for somebody in that early part of their deconstruction, or even before they're deconstructing. They might just be questioning and have doubts. Your book has the power to put a new perspective onto that story that will put some calm into someone else's life. So well done, Liz, and thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. When you write a book, you're alone mostly.
Yes.
So it helps to, hear that. And I have been very moved by the range of people who have found something to connect with in this work. And I believe that, as I've said, I believe that good art transcends time and culture and can reach us, and so my goal is to kind of make this masterwork a little bit more accessible to us here. And to your point, I think in the United States, but elsewhere, as kind of fascism is on the rise, and so often spearheaded by religious folk within my tribe.
You do realize it's only the people on the left who are the true fascists, don't you?
Oh,
or
I've
so
heard
all
this.
the Christians I read say. I don't know how they make that work, but apparently that's the case.
I feel the same way. Yes, this has been a strange season in the United States, politically. Not unique, probably, unfortunately, but just mystifying.
But there is some hope. I mean, we've read in the last 2 days only that person who shares half of his name with my name, Matt Gates, he's decided that maybe he's not worthy of a position at the top of law after all.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. That's what I have to say about that. I would say, I one of the things that has been interesting to think about, though, is that there will be a whole group of people who, whether they're Gen Z or whatever generation they are coming up right now in this culture and watching fascism, have its moment. And those people, so many American Christians lost faith, deconverted, deconstructed after Donald Trump was elected. And to be frank, I hope that happens again.
I'm convinced. I'm in multiple deconversion social media groups because of what I do with this podcast. And over the last 8 years, I've seen lots of people drop into those groups and express something along the lines of the fundamentalist religious people are fully Trump trained. I can't communicate with them anymore. My sanity is being affected. I don't know who I can turn to. I need you people. I need someone to listen to. And these people are finding themselves more and more in deconstruction social media groups because they seem to be the only people that get them. And so many of these, I don't know what the right adjective is, lonely people, there's a better word to use, but part of it is they're lonely, but they're rejected by their loved ones as well. They feel lost socially and politically, and they've got no one at home that they can trust. And they end up in these groups, and it is definitely triggering deconversion. And I am convinced, I've already said it publicly once, I am convinced that the next 4 years are going to see more of those hurt people looking for some solace, and the deconstruction and deconversion community are going to find those people, or those people are going to find the deconstruction and deconversion community.
I
And
hope
we
they
need
do.
to be
I mean,
ready for that.
yeah, I think the loneliness is true. So many of these folks just feel so misunderstood and so alien in their own culture. And I think there is a mercy in that. Any sort of unveiling that brings you into kind of a new truth, like rediscovering truth, whether in yourself or in the world, I think is worthwhile, even if it comes at great cost. And and that's not to say that we should not advocate on behalf of those who will be more likely to pay a cost. As I've said, I'm of a very privileged group in the United States. And so that's something I have to keep top of mind for myself to say, there are benefits, but also, the difficulties are going to come to me less. And so I need to be aware and mindful of those marginal identity, and kind of partnering with them as an ally. But I think one of the important things of this time is going to be providing sort of generous empathy to these people who in the past have held very harmful beliefs, right? Have hurt people with their theology or the way that they have enacted their theologies. And I think as I've thought through kind of what is a political response to fascism, I just continue to come back to this question, these ideas of story and empathy, where it's, we approach these people with curiosity. We tell them our stories. We make space for their story. That's how people really change. People don't change because we've convinced them of something. That's not really how anybody changes.
Right. So, okay, hard question time now. This really is feet to the coals kind of question, because I've seen it. I've seen this happen. When these hurt people arrive in these deconstruction groups and they need looking after, they need empathy, they need validation of their fears, because without that, they're on the verge of going crazy. Depression is a dark, hovering cloud. If they're not in it, it's a very real threat.
Yes.
Sometimes they have a fear of physical harm to themselves from people they love, and they arrive needing empathy. But the challenge that you give in the statement I read earlier is empathy to all. And I have seen it happen where one of those people arrives needing care, and then someone else gives empathy to their abuser, gives empathy to those who are causing them their anguish, mental and otherwise. And that creates a difficult dynamic. And I don't know what the answer is to there. How do we give empathy with all without making ourselves the enemy of all?
That's good. I appreciate that question so much, because that is a challenge. I think you kind of just have to take the person in front of you at their word.
Yep.
And start there, because ultimately you're not talking to their abuser. Their abuser is not in this group trying to get well.
Yeah.
So that's how I have tended to do this. I would say also, I don't see empathy as an excuse for bad behavior either. Like, I think it's very reasonable to tell the truth to these people, to confront these folks who are doing wrong and are abusive. I think we can say this is an evil behavior. This is not acceptable, and this person does not need to stay in relationship with that person. And I say this as someone personally. I am no contact with certain family members.
I'm sorry.
And for me, that has been important to, again, regain agency. I think there is a sense in which we feel, I think even culturally, where we want to kind of level the playing field. And by that, I mean, we feel uncomfortable sometimes making one person the enemy. And I think we should feel some discomfort with that. I think most people have many sides to themselves. And yet that doesn't mean we need to be in close relationship with every person, right? I'm not going to go to Thanksgiving dinner with my president-elect.
Yeah.
I am not even remotely interested. I think one of the challenges is for ourselves kind of reckoning with what, do I want to forgive? What does forgiveness look like? What would reconciliation look like? Do I want that? How do I
Yeah.
keep myself safe? And I do think there are stages as well in how we kind of interact with people. For someone who comes into a group like that and they are deeply afraid for good reasons, that's not actually a time to be talking about their abuser.
Yeah.
That is a time to be focused on them because they are the victim. And I think it's incredibly harmful for us to be sort of both sidesing in that moment. So for me, I would say
fair comment. I think you're wise there.
I think that being able to respond to this person and what they need takes priority over other responses. I think for myself in my own journey of healing from abuse, it has been important for me to reach a place where I can say, I do forgive my abuser out of my own power and agency, and I don't want to be in contact.
Yeah.
And
yes,
I think
the two can be true, and that's fair.
Yeah. So I actually do have a lot of empathy for them, and I also don't feel like I have to sacrifice myself in that decision. I can be empathic and out of relationship.
Yeah. No, I think that's very good advice. Thank you, Liz. And again, that was something I sprung on you without any warning. I didn't tell you that was going to be a question that was coming up. So thank you for being on your feet and on your toes with that one. And I think we do need to be mindful. And I think your comment on deal with the person in front of you is very wise and very insightful. And that's probably the best we can do in the moment. And sometimes, and if there is a cause of pain out there, if they're not present, then it's okay not to talk about that and just deal with the person in front of you and just don't bring it up. But I think we're going to see this kind of challenge more and more as people come in. And I know Thanksgiving is a really big thing for you guys, and I believe it's around them. Have you had it, or is it coming up soon?
It's coming up. Mm-hmm.
Us English people, we just can't keep up. It just doesn't feature on our radar. Thanksgiving, here
but you
in
have
the
Guy
UK.
Fawkes Day, and you have other great holidays. Mm-hmm.
Yes, fair we do. But we only travel across the country to see the family that we have difficulties with for Christmas. We don't do it for these other days.
Well, I am a little jealous about that. So,
but I do remember from years gone by that Thanksgiving seems to be the big one on these groups with Americans in them, that people struggle with their family. It feels to me, maybe you can correct me or not, but it feels to me that sometimes Thanksgiving is more religious than Christmas and Easter over in America.
I think it's probably more about family. And so in that way, I would say it is probably more religious. I think American religion overall is much more about family than it is about Jesus or God. So I would say like the nuclear family is much more important to Americans. So in that respect, I think there are a lot of expectations around family interaction.
And when you're the sole black sheep of the family, what a horrible phrase that is. We need to we need to come up with an alternative phrase on that. Too many negative connotations. But when you're the one that stands out in the family, you've dared to question the patriarchy, you've dared to question literalism or whatever other imagined sin that you've done. And the thought of being with your extended family of 20 people where everybody's on the same book and all the conversation is about the same thing, and it's hurtful to you and harmful to you, but you have to do it. We should be mindful of that across the country. there are many thousands of people having to endure that in a couple of weeks' time.
Yes. Yes. And I feel for them. Fortunately for me, I'm just having friends over. So that'll be fun.
That sounds great. Let's make it about friends. Yes. That sounds so good. Yes.
It's a lot more fun, I promise.
Yeah. I'm the parent of an only child, and so I'm fairly sure that as she gets older and more autonomous and has her own place, these kinds of periods will be as much more for her about friends than it will be about family. And maybe one day I'll find myself being in the minority because she's surrounded by friends and I'm just there because I'm old and half senile and no one else will take me.
You're with her. Yeah.
Yes. That's the curse that I've blessed her with. So going back to your book then, so you focused a big chunk on your book about Sarah. What was your inspiration for doing that? Because there are other women in Genesis you could have focused on, or being radical, you could have invented a heroine all of your own and centered her around the Tower of Babel. There is lots and lots of meat to be eked out of Genesis. So what made you pick Sarah, and what attracted you to Sarah, and why did you want to give more power to her voice? Because she doesn't have much of a voice. We have offered some criticism of her in this conversation, but in your book the criticism is a lot less, and you do actually offer something good about Sarah in your book as well. Why did you do that?
Sarah is a complex figure, and I find her interesting psychologically. We actually have a lot of her words in the book of Genesis, and which is not always true for women in the story, but she speaks a lot to her husband, and we have that recorded by the authors, whatever that looked like,
Yes.
Again, the historical questions to me are just a little bit less interesting. So yeah. I know that I'm the way I'm talking sometimes sounds like I'm taking it completely literally, but actually I'm just accepting the reality of the authors.
Yeah, you're treating the text as it's laid out. And like I say, while I am somebody who likes to see those critical questions about historicity, and I love those, they're not for everybody. And to some people, and may I even dare say it, the people who get the most out of your book, those questions would have been a distraction. So treat the text as it is. And I appreciated that. It took me a couple of chapters to get into it, but I genuinely appreciated it.
Okay. Well, that's where I'm coming from on this. I just for your listeners who are wondering, but that's, so within the text, right? So Sarah does a lot of talking. We have a lot of quotation marks that are attributed to her. And yet I felt like her perspective was still sidelined. And I felt myself very interested in what would it feel like to be a matriarch with no children, or supposedly a matriarch, someone who's supposed to be. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about what did it mean that she was barren, and what did it mean, in fact, that most of the Israelite matriarchs were barren. And that's actually something the rabbis also think about a lot, interestingly. And though they disagree amongst themselves about many things, they don't disagree about this. They kind of said the reason that the matriarchs are barren is because God desires their prayers and supplications. So in other words, God wants to hear their voices. God wants to hear their prayers and to commune with them. I find that to be a very interesting perspective, because I think the way that these matriarchs are framed within the tradition that I grew up in was just they were just sideline characters. They just were not that important. They just happened to have wombs, for these important male characters. And in fact, there was a Jewish feminist scholar who talked about Sarah and Abraham come from from this Babylonian heritage, and they worship these maternal deities. And so, and they were going to be much more likely to give fertility to Sarah and Abraham, this couple who were unable to have children, right? And so then they leave the region and leave behind their gods in that region. And now Sarah's kind of faced with the prospect of, theoretically, this God is saying that we're going to have children, but we're not. And by the way, this God seems to have some male tendencies, even though I don't believe that God is male or female. There is a sense in the text where it seems to sort of suggest that, or at least, people have suggested that, let's say. And so there is kind of a question around, can this deity actually do this work? Because this deity doesn't seem to be female. Like, this is a female area.
Yeah.
Can this deity do this? So one of the things that the rabbis, in saying that God wants the prayers of the matriarchs, the idea is that God is in pursuit of these women. So even as Abraham has received this unique sort of call to go out into the desert and have, you will have land, you will have children, you will have blessing, as many children as sand on the seashore kind of thing. The rabbis are sort of claiming the same for Sarah. They're saying that part of leaving Ur was a way for God to pursue this woman as a matriarch as well. And then, of course, even in the next chapters, we see God pursuing Hagar in a similar way. So if you're looking at this kind of pattern, who do these authors say that this deity is? This deity is in pursuit of women and the men around them. And yet, one of the things that was fascinating to me is going back to the Midrashim again. The rabbis talk about how if Sarah had been in the desert with Hagar when she ran away the second time, they say that she actually would not have seen God, that God would have hidden themselves from Sarah because God only intended to talk to Hagar. So there is this element of kind of God picking the person at the bottom still. But, obviously among, Abraham is at the top of the food chain in his family.
Yeah.
And then comes Sarah, and then comes Hagar. And then the boys come, the children, and they're on top of the women, right? So there is this element of hierarchy you're dealing with. And I think I felt really inspired by Dr. Wilda Gaffney, whose work explores sort of the side characters of the Old Testament. So she in particular is fascinated with unnamed peoples, or peoples who are conquered, or women whose stories have been kind of forgotten or overlooked. And I found her approach really compelling. If it made me think a lot about, how do we write history, and how do we perceive what is true history, and how do we interpret whose story should be central. I think, being female myself, I've always been honestly more interested in the females in the Bible. Those who are women in the Bible are, theoretically they are my sisters. And so at the very least, they are stories about ancestral women, ancient kind of primeval stereotypes of women. And I am fascinated by that. And I think, interestingly, when I look among ancient works, this work has a lot of female characters with a lot of psychological depth. And I find that to be really fascinating too, thinking about what were women even like at that time, in the BCE eras, before the Common Era. What were women like? What was expected of women? I think I just have found all those questions very interesting, and much more interesting through the lens of these females.
Thank you for that. And I think there is something about being a chap that removes a lot of nuance and a lot of knowledge from the Bible. Let me illustrate that with one of my own personal experiences. So I grew up in the missionary environment in Zambia, and it wasn't until, I actually can't even remember when it was, but at some point as an adult, I looked back and I had memories and I read stories and I realized that the girls in the environment that I was brought up in, had a tougher time than me. They were judged by their appearance. I could wear, it was in the 70s when I was in Zambia, so I could get away with wearing really tight shorts that were effectively hot pants. Whereas a girl would never get away with that. In fact, when I look back at some of the school photos I've got, the girls, unless it's PE, are always in a skirt or a dress, and it is always down to the ankles. No exceptions ever. And as a boy growing up in that environment, you never appreciate that. You never get that. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I look back and I realized, hang on a minute, girls had it harder. And that's before you get onto the whole issues of inappropriate sexualization, which again, I never got. I never appreciated that until I started hearing podcasts where women talked about their missionary kid experience or their deconstruction experience. I went, oh, well, of course. And there is something about being a boy in that environment where you are completely immune to it. And that is completely a feature of my upbringing. And I feel almost embarrassed that it took me until being an adult. But I can't blame 8-year-old Matthew for not getting it. But I can blame
Absolutely.
blame 48-year-old Matthew for not doing anything about it. So where was I going with that? Where I'm going with that is when you look at the Bible and you look at the story that you're talking about, and you look at, this is an environment which is physically tough. There is no sanitation as we know it, either through running water or through personal hygiene and everything in between. Women had a harder life than men. Let's just accept that. We're not being weak by admitting that. Let's just be honest. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. So I think the women who are not named and not given enough page space are actually being done a disservice, because like the girls in my missionary environment had a tougher time, the women in that environment also had a tougher time. Let's accept that. Let's acknowledge that, and see what we can do to rectify that.
Yeah, give me a lot of, well, first of all, I appreciate what you've said so much. And I agree with you. How could you know what you don't know?
Yeah.
I think a lot of us have that experience within white culture, quote unquote, white, whatever that is, where we realize, oh, our Black and brown brothers and sisters have been dealing with a level of hard that we haven't even seen.
Yeah.
That is a common experience in many cultural expressions. I mean, it looks different, and it's certainly true between men and women. And, I think one of the things that I found to be very important is to be able for myself to kind of own the ways that I have failed other people by not seeing them,
Yeah.
And, I agree with you. All we can do is kind of from now on, I will do what I can to be a safe person for them.
Yeah.
And to de-centered myself. I mean, it's, it's just a challenge. But I think one of the things in the scriptures, that gave me more, let's say, empathy for Sarah, because so often she's been demonized, like we talked about, either by commentators, it's her fault. She should have just been fertile, or whatever, she's the one who suggested the issue with Hagar anyway, it gave me some helpful context to think about the rabbinical code, at least later. It's hard to tell kind of what was cultural at the time or not, but at least when the rabbis are writing their commentaries on this, they are talking about, it was a custom that after 10 years of infertility in the ancient world, that a man could divorce his wife.
Wow.
And he was completely, within his rights to do that. And even within Judaism, it was like, well, The man is responsible for having children before God. The be fruitful and multiply command must be fulfilled. And we're not going to blame women for not being able to necessarily, but it is on the man to be fruitful and multiply. So he should probably divorce his wife and try to have kids with somebody else. So then you notice in the scriptures, kind of depending on when this was written and kind of why it was written, I kind of wonder if in the kind of post-exilic period within Judaism, there was this they would have had some of these codes
right,
when this book was probably written, the book of Genesis. And so it is notable that Sarah recommends Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate after 10 years in Canaan.
Right.
They have settled for 10 years. And so there is a sense, for me, I realized she was doing what she could, to keep her husband, to keep her status, to keep, and that doesn't mean her motives were pure. They certainly were not pure toward Hagar.
No.
She very much was using her power against her slave, the enslaved woman.
Mm.
And yet I, also thinking through that, I think she's meant to be more of a sympathetic character than we often see her as.
But her motivation there is self-preservation.
Right.
So with that as a motive, okay, yes, and within the culture of the time, okay, yeah, we can understand it. It's not great, but we can understand it. But
right.
The thing that's really jumping out at me, though, in all of this language, and again, it would probably bug me to hell if I was to read that story again, is it's always the woman's fault that there are no children.
Right.
There must have come a point in time when we realized that men could also have a fault that created this scenario.
Impossible.
And they must have been aware of it at that time in history, that men could also have a fault. They must have. But it's always the woman who's barren.
You would hope. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I felt so sick reading stories of how Abraham interacted with his wife and with Hagar, just feeling the sense of powerlessness that these women experienced.
Yeah.
The sense of total reliance on this one man for either his advocacy or his money or his, and I'm thinking about, Abraham took Sarah down to Egypt and allowed Pharaoh to take her into his harem. Just pretty wild. And then God afflicts them with plagues and, Sarah leaves, and theoretically that's where they pick up Hagar. But, then it happens later too. And Abraham is afraid and gives his wife to a marauding king. It's just one of these, you kind of get these glimpses of what it was like to be a woman in this kind of primeval, kind of patriarchal time of history. And it looks terrifying,
Yes. It's day-to-day survival. It's not living, it's surviving. Now, that's how it comes across now when you're reading it through modern eyes. And life must have been hard. It makes you wonder how the human race survived at all, really.
Yes. Yes, I totally agree.
So my mind is trying to dig out a memory, and I genuinely can't remember. Did Abraham and Sarah have any other children after Isaac? Or is Isaac the only one
I
that's
don't
recorded?
think that they did. And the reason is that Sarah dies soon after the encounter on the mountaintop.
Okay.
So Abraham does remarry, and I believe he has children after that with that woman. And sometimes the rabbis say that that's Hagar. I mean, sometimes they say he went back to her.
Wow.
But it is unclear from the text, and so I like thinking about it like that, but I also am like, maybe not.
Yeah, I know.
Would he have married an enslaved woman?
Enthusiastic about that, yeah.
Right. Yes, exactly. You would hope not.
Yeah, it's Interesting segue. Liz, thank you. I'm just watching the time. Is there anything that I've not asked you that you really want to talk about or really want my listeners to be aware of?
I think I just hope, one of the hopes I've had for this book is that it would provide a sense of permission and to be creative with ancient work in general, but I would say the Bible in particular. Regardless what you believe, it is a very influential book.
Yes.
And
yes,
so I think there is a lot to be gained from its close study, even if we don't think it's true or factual, let's say. I think there is still truth to be found there. That is inspiring and interesting. And as I said, I find it a very psychologically true book, and it's very ancient.
It is. Thank you so much, Liz. So your book is Knock at the Sky. Lovely title. I really do like the title. Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. Your book genuinely is a soft balm to those who are in a doubting stage of that part of the Bible. It gave me, a hard-nosed atheist, a new appreciation of that story from the Bible. Anybody who's struggling with Genesis will get something out of your book. Listeners, I do genuinely recommend it. Links in the show notes to Liz's website and to Barnes & Noble, where you can get the book. I am sure other booksellers are available. This episode will probably come out in the new year, Liz, but I will let you know when it goes live. Thank you so much for your time. So that leaves me only with my usual final question. Do you have a favourite Bible character, and who are they?
I think it is currently Hagar, because of her courage and her unique interactions that she had with God. I find her really fascinating. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good choice. You won't be surprised to know that you are the first person that I've asked this question to who has picked Hagar. I'm trying that you're not the first one to have picked a female, but you are the first one to have picked Hagar. But I'm unsurprised I did wonder if you might pick Sarah, and then right at the last second I thought, nah, she's not going to go with Sarah, it's going to be Hagar. I get it, and you do give a little bit more appreciation for her. I think she deserves more consideration. Your book gives a very good excuse to give her more consideration. Maybe we can do a campaign to have a novel and a film about Hagar's life.
Please, I would love that. Yes.
That could be very interesting. Who would play her though? Maybe Halle Berry.
Who would play her? It'd be Halle Berry, or it would be Zendaya was in Dune. I bet it'd be Zendaya.
Yes. My daughter's a fan of Zendaya because she watched her in she was in a sitcom when she was younger, something to do with spies or something like that. I seem to remember. Okay. Before she hit it bigger and hit the big screen.
And such.
I've not watched part 2 of Dune yet. I've watched the first one. And I went to watch the original Dune before watching the one, because one must do that. The quality of the special effects shows the time period. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
Thank you once again, Liz. You have been a glorious guest. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I am hopeful that when your next book comes out, we'll have another chance for another conversation. I'm looking forward to reading it already. Do you have anything that you're allowed to tell me about that might be in the works for the future?
Oh, well, I think I will turn my attention to the prophets next.
Okay. Is there a female prophet? They're all blokies, aren't they?
There are 7 female prophets, but they do not have their own books. So that is a challenge for me to find out information about them.
Yes, excellent. That does sound interesting. And yes, that is a conversation I'll absolutely love to have. So thanks once again, Liz. You have been listening to Still Unbelievable. And until next time and forevermore, be empathetic. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.